humans, my name is Dale Kingsmill. This video that you are about to watch is actually, it's a video lecture I did. Sort of a program they do for high schoolers to come and earn some uni credits early. This particular lecture was me talking about the dying and reviving God for, I think it was for the history department, but I always, when I do lectures for the history department, because I'm talking about mythology, I talk about them with kind of an English lit bent, and even sometimes a little bit of digital media thrown into the mix. So, yeah, I thought you might enjoy it. It would be nice to have it out there somewhere. I don't think I was forbidden from doing it. Fingers crossed, because it's out here now. I hope you enjoy it, and on with the lecture. Hello there, students of the world. My name is Dale. I am going to be doing your lecture today. I'm lecturing for the history department, but my degree is actually in English literature and theatre of all things, with a minor in digital media studies. So I'm a little bit all over the place. The reason that I'm lecturing for the history department is that I have a YouTube channel where I have for many years retold the stories of ancient mythologies, particularly Greek mythology. So I guess I'm kind of that place where history and literature meet. So of course, to start us off today, I'm gonna just tell you a bunch of stories. So settle in, gather around the campfire, children, and let me tell you a tale. Or four. I'm gonna tell you 4 stories. So buckle up. Alright, here we go. Osiris was the king of all of Egypt. He was very happy there with his wife and sister Isis, until one day he was betrayed by his brother Set, or Seth. Set tricked Osiris. He had a box made that was exactly to Osiris's measurements, and happened to be painted with a picture of Osiris, and it was this incredible box made of gold. It was a sarcophagus, but sarcophagi hadn't been seen in the world before this, and so Set shows up to a party one night and goes, "Look what I brought! It's a very fancy box. Whosoever fits into this very fancy box we'll get to keep it." It's like the worst version of Cinderella. Of course, everyone lies down in the box one at a time. None of them fit the box until, lo and behold, Osiris gets in the box and it's a perfect fit. And Set slams the lid down on him, nails it shut, and has Osiris thrown into the Nile. Isis searches far and wide for her husband's body, and eventually she finds it. And she and Thoth, who was the god of wisdom, sat down together in secret to try and come up with a new spell that would bring Osiris back to life. In the meantime, she does a little necromantic ritual and does get it on with the ghost of Osiris, and is impregnated by his spirit. 10 months later, she has a little bouncing baby bird-headed boy whose name is Horus, but of course Set has caught wind by this time that they're trying to resurrect the old king that he'd murdered, and so Set goes out looking for Isis and the baby, and he sets fire to the marshland that they're hiding in, and Isis has to flee with baby Horus, but she has to leave behind Osiris' sarcophagus, and when Set finds it, he flies into a rage, and he chops the body up into lots of little pieces and scatters them all across the world. A bunch of the goody gods once again come together in secret. They go searching far and wide, and they find all the pieces of Osiris, put him together, wrap them all up in linen so that they'll hold together. Mummies. Because Thoth's spell that he's come up with can only work if the body is in one piece. Unfortunately, there was one body part that did not make it to the final version. Set was particularly mad, and he threw the penis into the Nile to be devoured by crocodiles. So, you know. So what happens is that the spell is a success. It successfully, reincarnates, revives Osiris, but because there is a piece of his body missing, he cannot fully return to the land of the living, and instead he takes position as the king of the Egyptian afterlife. Boom! Osiris. Done. Over in Greek mythology, Zeus was having yet another affair. At this point, it could be any number of stories. Zeus was having an affair with a woman named Semele. Semele's all in love. She's telling her sisters about how she's having this, very romantic affair with the king of the gods, and her sisters don't believe her. They say, "You need proof that it's really Zeus." And Semele, it gets in her head, and she thinks, yeah, you know what? He never has shown me his true self. I'll ask him for that. And she asked Zeus to show his true self to her. But when he did, her mortal body could not cope it's very Cthulhu, couldn't cope with the reality of such a divine being, and she burst into ashes, just exploded. But she was pregnant at the time, and the baby was sort of about 6 months into gestating, definitely wasn't ready to be outside the womb yet, so Zeus picked it up and stitched it into his thigh so that it could have sort of a second womb to finish its gestating. And finally, after the full gestation period, Dionysus was born. Hera, Zeus's wife, did not particularly like baby Dionysus, given that he was the product of this sordid affair, and so Hera was really gung-ho about trying to kill him. So she did lots of things, but one of the sort of the important one that will come up in this story for our purposes is that at some point she basically handed off the baby to a bunch of titans who tore him to pieces, stuck those pieces in a boiling pot, and by some accounts ate him. But Rhea, who was of course, Zeus's mother, so Dionysus's grandmother. Rhea was a Titan goddess, and she brought Dionysus back to life. And then he was disguised as a goat for a while so that Hera couldn't find him. Hip hip hooray. Once Dionysus had grown up, people decided that maybe he should be allowed to be not a goat again, so they turned him back into his human form, and Hera went, "Wait a minute," and struck him mad as punishment. And so Dionysus kind of just wandered around as a crazy dude for a long time, murdering people, conquering countries, swimming across rivers on tigers, all sorts of things happened. But eventually Rhea did cleanse him and lift his insanity. Then he got driven insane again. He's the god of madness. What do you expect? But in general, Dionysus sort of traveled to the east and then back again, bringing with him the cult of wine and growing his own cult of followers as he went, proving his divinity as he went. After a particular scrap with a bunch of pirates, Dionysus wanted to travel to the island of Naxos, and he sort of, booked a ride on this boat, and it turned out that the sailors were actually pirates, and they attempted to kidnap him, but he was a god, so he turned them all into dolphins and took over the ship. This was pretty good evidence that he was in fact divine, that he was a god, that he was worthy of Olympus. But there was one final thing that he had to do, and that is basically to metaphorically conquer death. So what Dionysus did was he traveled to a lake in a place called Lerna, the lake is famous for being just unfathomable. It is incredibly deep. No one has ever been able to reach the bottom of it. Anyone who tries to swim across it gets swept out and dragged under the water, despite the fact that it looks perfectly still from the surface. It's a pretty famously terrible lake, and everyone says it is an entrance to the underworld. So Dionysus hitches a ride in a boat out to the very middle of this lake, and he dives to the bottom in order to enter the underworld. Just keep swimming until you find yourself in a lake in the underworld. And so Dionysus was able to rescue his mother. He was able to rescue Semele, take her spirit, bring her back to the surface, where he and she both ascended to Olympus and were accepted among the gods. Dionysus, boom, out the way. Balder, son of Odin and Frigg, was the most beloved of all the Norse gods, the Aesir. He was handsome, he was heroic, he was charming. Everybody loved this dude. One night Balder had a nightmare. He had a nightmare that he was struck with an arrow and he was killed, and he said, "Oh man, this was a bad dream." And his mother Frigg freaked out about it. She was like, "What if it's a prophecy?" So what she did was she wandered around the entire world and made everything in existence promise that they would never harm Balder. Most things were very happy to agree to this because, again, Balder's a chill dude. Everybody loves him. And so by the time that Frigg makes it back, she says, "Look, Balder, nothing in the world will kill you. See?" And she hurls a rock at his head, and it just, scoots around, refuses to hit him. Everything is promised not to do any damage. And all the gods think, "This is a great game. This is the best idea." And they all just stand in a circle, throwing stuff at him and trying to hit him with swords and whatnot. Nothing will hurt him. Loki, god of mischief, was kind of like, this seems too neat. I want to throw a spanner in these works. And he goes and he disguises himself, I think, as a giantess, and he goes and he has a conversation with Frigg, and carefully through conversation manages to find out that there was one thing that didn't agree that it wouldn't kill Balder, that it wouldn't hurt Balder, and that was the mistletoe plant. And so Loki went out and he got some mistletoe and he fashioned fashioned it into an arrow. Now, by the time he got back, all the gods are still playing, let's throw things at Balder, except for Hoder, who was Balder's brother, his blind brother. And Loki said, why aren't you joining in on the fun, Hoder? And Hoder says, well, I'm blind, I can't see where he is, so throwing things at him, not really my area. But Loki says, you know what? Here, take this bow and this arrow, and I will guide your hand, and you can join in the fun. Here you go. He hands over, of course, the mistletoe arrow, and when Hoder lets it fly, Balder is shot and he is killed. Everyone is, of course, completely distraught. There's a Viking funeral, which involves, Thor kicks a dwarf. It's kind of a farce. The gods travel to Hel to speak with Hel and convince her that she should let the spirit of Balder come back and return to the Aesir, return to life. And Hel she's not super keen on this. In true underworld ruler style, she says, okay, look, I'm not going to be a total hard ass about this, but you have to do something, you have to accomplish something in order for this to be successful, all right? You need to get everything in existence to weep over Balder's death. If you say that he is so beloved, that everything in existence is mourning his death, then you have to make sure that you've gotten every single thing to weep over the loss of Balder, and then I'll let him return to you. But of course, at some point they find a giantess, Loki in disguise, who refuses to weep over Balder's death, and Balder is not returned to them. Loki gets imprisoned, there's a whole thing, Ragnarok happens, world ends. But finally, after the heat death of the universe, the material plane wraps back around and is reborn, and when it is, Balder will be resurrected. Mary and Joseph haven't had sex yet, but one day they're visited by an angel who says, hey, yo, just so you know, you're gonna have a baby. They're like, what? And the angel says, yeah, it's the baby of God, okay? You got God, his baby. You're having his baby. Mary and Joseph are like, oh, okay. Seems like a lot of responsibility. About 9 months later, there happens to be a census in which everyone has to travel back to the town of their birth in order to be counted. So a heavily pregnant Mary and Joseph travel back to Joseph's hometown of Bethlehem, and everywhere is booked because of this census, and so the last place that they can find to stay for the night is a stable. And of course, in this moment, Mary gives birth to the beautiful baby Jesus Christ. Now, some odd 30 years later, Jesus is an adult and he has to travel around basically performing miracles and spreading the word that he is the Son of God. And he and his disciples are very successful. After some time of traveling and spreading the word and performing miracles, Jesus has become pretty freaking famous. People will travel far and wide to see him. They'll gather in these huge crowds to hear what he has to say. And as he becomes more and more popular, the existing church and the existing authorities become more and more disgruntled with his presence, and they're seeking ways to shut him down. They keep trying to trick him and catch him out, and it never quite works. But of course, the whole plan is that he who is pure, who is the Son of God, he will be sacrificed essentially in order to cleanse everyone else, all of these non-divine mortal beings, of their sins. And so one night, one of Jesus's disciples, Judas, betrays Jesus and he hands Jesus over to his enemies. And Jesus is brought on trial for all the things he said, for claiming to be the Son of God, the Messiah, for claiming to be the King of the Jews, for teaching all these new things that fly in the face of the old laws. And Jesus is condemned and is, of course, nailed to a cross and dies in very gruesome fashion. Several of the women who were close to Jesus over the next few days go to his tomb to, mourn, go through the typical mourning rituals. But on the third day, they arrive at his tomb, and the big boulder that was rolled over the entrance was gone. And Jesus' body wasn't there. It had vanished. And when Jesus appears to a bunch of the disciples, they don't believe their eyes. They say, this isn't possible. You're not Jesus. And Jesus shows them. He's like, you call these holes in my hands Not real, huh? All right. Doubting Thomas. They all go, oh heck, it is Jesus, it really is, and he climbs up a hill and he ascends to heaven. Now, obviously, these are all really condensed Sparks Notes versions of these stories. Each of these stories that we've just talked about falls into a pattern that was identified by who the hell wrote The Golden Bough? James George Frazer. Frazer wrote this huge, like genuinely monstrous book. It's something like 13 volumes, I'm not even kidding, where he breaks down, basically he's pitching the idea, his sort of overarching thesis statement, to simplify it, is that cultures travel through different, it's a very structuralist idea, they travel through different phases where they begin in a place of sort of mysticism, that mysticism develops into religion, and then that religion develops into scientific thought. That's not so much what we're talking about here. What we're talking about is that in Frazer's writing in The Golden Bough, he identifies these really interesting recurring shapes of story shapes, if you will, that are common and identifiable across all different global cultures. One of those being the dying and reviving God. They defeat death, and Frazer kind of wraps that all up into the story of winter's death and spring's renewal. But what is interesting about it is how frequently this story shape pops up across so many different and distant cultures. Real quick, I have to make note that we can't become concerned. Be careful of falling into the pit trap of which story came first. There is a temptation, particularly when you are, raised within modern Western society, to look for an original story. You might look at these 4 stories and go, okay, well, which one's oldest? The other ones are copying them. The hierarchy of authenticity is almost completely arbitrary when it comes to comparing these ancient stories. Especially when you remember that the things that we are calling primary texts with regards to mythology are numerous and distant from their oral beginnings. And the concept of a prime, original text is a very modern idea anyway. It kind of originated with the printing press and mass production. So it gets a little bit weird when we start trying to apply that logic over the top of these incredibly old mythologies of the world. Chaim Perelman, a philosopher who wrote about history, said, "No historian can go down into the past like a deep-sea diver to describe what he sees. We can know the past only from the traces of it that remain." And it's the same deal with these mythological narratives. We are having to piece them together from the scraps that we have available to us. Take the story of Osiris, for example. Osiris and the tragedy of his death and his resurrection is one of the most complete narratives that we have access to from Egyptian mythology. And even that is because it was just such a popular story. We actually only have access to it in the form of just so many funerary texts. So we have, for example, what we call the Egyptian Book of the Dead. This is just a collection of all sorts of different funerary spells, basically. It's kind of like gathering mythology via a recipe blog. This person is telling you how to bake scones and make ice cream and whatnot, and at the start they give you a bit of a story of them and their grandma. But eventually, if you look at the whole recipe blog, you might be able to start to piece together a story of this person's life. That's basically what people have done in order to gather and put together the story of Osiris. But something else that comes with that is that the story is not necessarily internally consistent. Elements of it change, they contradict one another. Some of the story pieces are sourced from the Middle Kingdom, while others are from the Old Kingdom, which, by the way, that's a very long span of time if you're unfamiliar. The point being that it gets a little bit silly to still try and apply modern concepts of ownership and originality. So keep that in mind as I continue to talk about story shapes, recurring story shapes, shapes across space and time. We're not looking for what was the original story and which ones were copycats, because that's not really how it works. So now, looking at those 4 stories that I told, we see a very broad shape that is common to all of them. There is a central divine figure who is killed and who is brought back to life. That big framework is common to these 4 stories and, many, many others. But if you start to look closer, there are actually more detailed elements that do appear in each of the stories. Additional details common between them. An established authority figure and their beloved son. You've got Osiris and Horus. You've got God and Jesus, Odin and Balder. What was the other story I told? Dionysus, Zeus and Dionysus. There's a common traitor figure, Set and Judas, right? Another example, after each of their resurrections, these figures are removed from the world. There's a separation from the mortal plane in some capacity. Osiris has to remain in the underworld. Dionysus ascends to join the gods on Olympus. Their work on Earth is done. We're going to keep using these stories as touchstones to come back to throughout, so just keep them in your minds. Oh, Cernunnos. I want to briefly touch on Cernunnos. So, there is a figure known as the Horned God. That's what Cernunnos means. Guy with horns, basically. The imagery that goes along with this deity is that of a bearded man with antlers sitting, or horns, sitting cross-legged, surrounded by both prey animals and predator animals. It's pretty specific. Now, this imagery that I've just described to you it's been identified in all sorts of different places. Italy, Denmark, France, Greece, as far-flung as India. What's interesting about it is that it doesn't seem like this is a depiction of a single being. These are different local gods who are, for the most part, fairly insignificant, or at least we think they are, based on the fact that very little information has survived about them. The name Cernunnos is applied to all of these different horned deities who sit with their legs crossed, surrounded by animals. Because the imagery is so similar, the name was actually taken from a single damaged carving that was discovered at Notre Dame in Paris. It has an incomplete inscription. It's got the C and the S worn off, so all you can read is Anano, but people figured out that it would have once said Cernunnos, and since then it's just been used as the go-to term for countless occurrences of this horned one. So the reason I bring this up, and if you keep in mind those 4 dying and reviving god stories that I told you at the beginning, is that what we're looking at here are story shapes that are baked into not just one culture, but into, seemingly to some extent, human culture as a whole. Ancient cultures, and particularly oral cultures, have a strong tradition of mimesis. Mimesis being the word that is the basis for the word meme. It means a thing that can be copied. Basically copy-pasted. It's the same basis as the word mime. You copy something. In the very first paragraph of the very first page of the Rutledge Handbook of Greek Mythology, Robin Hard says, "The myths of the ancient Greeks, like the myths of most other cultures, were forever in a state of flux, undergoing a constant change as they were passed on by word of mouth and retold in different ways by authors of successive ages." With this comes things like regional variants of stories. We just talked about Cernunnos, but you can even see within one culture how you end up with regional, local variations on stories that share the same structure. For example, the story of Tantalus and Pelops. Tantalus was a good friend of the Olympian gods in the early days. Even though he was immortal, he was invited to come and hang out on Olympus. But one day, the gods came to visit him at his house for dinner. But Tantalus didn't have any meat to serve the gods. Oh no! And whether just to be a spiteful bad person or because he genuinely somehow thought this was the best idea, Tantalus murdered his youngest son, Pelops, cut him up and put him in a stew and served him to the gods. The Olympian gods were like, dude, I'm not eating that. That's people. The gods brought Pelops back to life and they punished Tantalus. He was imprisoned in Tartarus forever. Meanwhile, elsewhere, there is a story of Lycaon and his son Nyctimus. Similarly, at one time, Zeus visited the house of Lycaon in disguise as a, mortal beggar or something, and Lycaon decided it would be a great trick to feed this person his chopped up youngest son. Chop him up, they put him in a stew, they serve it to Zeus. And Zeus reveals his true identity, like the witch from the sorcerer from Beauty and the Beast. And he goes, "How dare you!" And he brings Nyctimus back to life, and he turns the rest of the family into wolves to punish them for what they did. And if you'll remember, in the story of Dionysus, back at the very beginning, there is a part of that story where Dionysus is a little baby, is cut up into pieces and boiled in a stew and eaten. But then the gods go, "Oh, that's horrifying," and they bring the little baby back to life. Why is this one of the constantly recurring stories in Greek mythology? I mean, I couldn't really say. Clearly, though, they didn't like child sacrifice. But you get that idea through Canonos, through these stories. You can see how the same story shape is stamped in different places and across different cultures. So we've looked a little bit now at how the same story shape exists across spatially distant cultures. Now I would like to look at temporally distant cultures. It is significant that we hold on to these stories throughout time, even if we're doing it subconsciously. In the West, certainly, we grow up immersed in the language of our literary heritage. It permeates pieces of everyday life. We call a person's weakness their Achilles heel. We call a book of maps an atlas. To be stuck between a rock and a hard place is a reference to sailing the line between Scylla and Charybdis. Scylla being a monster that inhabited the rocks, the cliffs, and Charybdis being a sea monster that created a whirlpool. And there are various stories, including that of Odysseus, where they had to sail between the two, try not to be destroyed by either. There is something in us that seems to be unable, we can't help but reuse the shapes of ancient stories. Let's chase a specific example through time, shall we? So, in the beginning, Eve gave Adam fruit from the tree of knowledge of good and evil. So the biblical story of the creation of woman is quickly, almost immediately followed by the story of her misleading man and leading him to fall from grace. In Genesis 3, Adam says, "It was the woman you put here with me. She gave me some of the fruit and I ate it." And the archetype of a tempting woman is seen again and again in the Bible. Bathsheba, Delilah, Jezebel, Salome, in Solomon's wives. Women who are accused of being so irresistible that they lead men to sin, sometimes simply by existing. Now, we move along in time. In classical literature, the motif appears again. Powerful women who are dangerous because of the sway they hold over men. In Homer's Odyssey, we're introduced to the sorceress, Circe. She turns the heroic sailors into pigs, and we get an excerpt. "Someone, goddess or woman, was singing inside in a clear voice. They called her and spoke to her, and at once she opened the shining doors and came out and invited them in, and all in their innocence entered. Only I waited for them outside, for I suspected treachery. Then the whole lot of them vanished away together, nor did one single one come out, though I sat and watched for a long time." Once again, the men in the story become the innocent victims of a woman's treachery. Once again, there's an emphasis on temptation, enhanced by a nurturing offer of sustenance and comfort. Eve offered Adam food in the form of the apple, and in this story, Circe brought them inside and seated them on chairs and benches and mixed them a potion with barley and cheese and pale honey, added to it Pramnian wine, but put into the mixture malignant drugs to make them forgetful. The writing also emphasizes her beauty and her sensuality as part of her evil. The gods advise Odysseus how to outwit Circe's malevolent guiles, direct quote, by directly instructing him that he must sleep with her adulterously. He has no choice but to sleep with the witch. But doing so is still perilous, and Odysseus is warned to bid her swear the great oath of the blessed gods that she has no other evil hurt that she is devising against you, so she will not make you weak and unmanned once you are naked. Once Circe is bested and cannot harm the sailors, the danger she poses as a manipulator of men is still central to her role, as seen by the regular refrain. It keeps coming up over and over again. "So she spoke, and the proud heart in me was persuaded." Time marches on, and the story takes yet another shape. Morgan Le Fay, the sorceress sister of King Arthur, acts as a recurring villainess who enchants and seduces men to bend them to her will. In La Morte d'Arthur, Thomas Mallory's French-inflected collection of Arthurian tales, she comes across Sir Lancelot asleep under a tree. I will put an enchantment on him so that he won't awake for 6 hours, and then I'll lead him away to my castle. She intends for him to give up his love for Guinevere and choose her instead. Only one lady can have your love, and that is Queen Guinevere. Now you will lose her forever, and she will lose you. As he contemplates how he might escape, Lancelot acknowledges his fear of Morgan because her sorcery has destroyed many a good knight. The motif re-emerges in Shakespearean theatre in the form of Lady Macbeth. She works to convince her husband to murder the king, but now her husband is getting cold feet. Her advice is to look like the innocent flower, but be the serpent under it. And again, treachery is hidden in offers of food and drink. His 2 chamberlains will I with wine and wassail so convince that memory, the water of the brain, shall be a fume, and the receipt of reason a limbic only. She even likens the men to pigs, reminiscent of the victims of Circe's magic, in their swinish sleep and memories that become fumes. La Belle Dame Sans Merci, a French term that literally translates to the beautiful lady without mercy, first appeared in poetry in the 15th century and reappeared as the title of a famous ballad by John Keats in 1819. The ballad recounts the story of a man enchanted by a beautiful fairy woman, and then left to waste away with longing. I met a lady in the meads, full beautiful, a fairy's child. Her hair was long, her foot was light, and her eyes were wild. She found me roots of relish sweet, and honey wild, and manna dew, and, sure, in language strained, she said, I love thee true. Yet, again, the wicked woman's entrancing of an innocent man is tied to both beauty and the nurturing law of food and drink. The enchanted man dreams of the many innocents who came before him, entrapped by the woman without mercy. Too late they tried to warn him of his peril. I saw pale kings and princes too, pale warriors, death pale were they all, who cried, La Belle Dame Sans Merci hath thee in her thrall. My example of choice from the 20th century, I'm sure it won't surprise you, is the femme fatale archetype of hard-boiled detective fiction. The works of Raymond Chandler commonly feature a woman defined both by her beauty and the danger she poses to men. She lowered her lashes until they almost cuddled her cheeks and slowly raised them again like a theater curtain. I was to get to know that trick. That was supposed to make me roll over on my back with all 4 paws in the air. That's an excerpt from The Big Sleep. Now, that term that I used, femme fatale, is, of course, another French term, this time meaning deadly woman. Even with the stark shift in genre from the work of Keats, such characterization can't escape markers of stories past. In The Long Goodbye, another Raymond Chandler book, the femme fatale character is associated with dreams and with robbing men of their power of action. Even more specifically, Chandler's use of the terms fairy princess and too pale familiarly echoes our foray with La Belle Dame Sans Merci. Right then a dream walked in. Her hair was the pale gold of a fairy princess. Her eyes were cornflower blue, a rare color, and the lashes were long and almost too pale. She sat down and slipped the gloves under the strap of her bag and thanked him with a smile so gentle, so exquisitely pure, that he was damn near paralyzed by it. And in my home court of media, the popular Dungeons & Dragons actual play series Critical Role also carries traces of these stories, whether it realizes it or not. In Campaign 2, they introduced the character of Avantika. She is a beautiful elven pirate with a French accent who wields a dark power. She deceives, she manipulates, and flirts up a storm, finally seducing one of the male heroes over a glass of wine. Now, of course, there are the obvious elements. She's a dangerous but enticing woman, so we've covered the broad scope of the archetype, but other small elements of earlier stories still manage to filter through. French, fey ancestry, dark magic, offerings of wine. These seemingly minor elements bear out the potency of earlier tales, resonating with the timeless echoes of storytelling. I really hope that Critical Role is mainstream enough now that I can just freely reference it like other TV shows. I mean, they've got a cartoon now. I mean, come on. You may not all know what I'm talking about, but there are some among you who do. I can guarantee that. All right, so that's one example, but now I want to kind of loop it back around to the dying and reviving God. Okay, so I want you to watch this clip.
And on the seventh day, Shirley shut down production.
Abed, Shirley has informed me that you are using school equipment on school property to make a religious film. She has filed an official complaint invoking the separation of church and state. I point out the irony to her already.
Don't give a crap. Let's be ironic. Shut it down.
Abed, are you making a religious film?
All movies are religious to me.
Nice. But is it a movie about Jesus?
Is The Matrix? Is RoboCop? Is Superman Returns? All stories are about death and resurrection.
I've got one. Wrath of Khan.
It's a good one.
Spock sacrifices himself for the crew and gets reborn. How captivating was Ricardo Montalban in that? I'm serious.
Except in Abed's film, the character's name isn't Spock.
That's true. It's Abed.
Oh, I'm getting creative goosebumps here. I love Charlie Kaufman.
I need to run into editing for 1 second, but if you want, we can grab you a chair and you could watch a take.
I would love that. I've never watched a take before. This is exciting.
You...
Say what you will about Abed, but the man cannot be killed. And it's almost like he's Jesus.
I got it.
So right there, Abed from Community has pointed out how many stories, modern stories, are still repeating this tale of the divine being who dies and is resurrected. I'm not going to go into every single thing that he mentioned, but I do want to look at a couple of examples. First, let's start with The Matrix.
Goodbye, Mr. Anderson.
Neo, I'm not afraid anymore. The Oracle told me that I would fall in love and that the man that I loved would be the one. So you see, you can't be dead. You can't be. Because I love you. You hear me? I love you. Now get up.
No.
What you saw there was Neo, who up to this point seemingly was a case of mistaken identity. There's a prophecy about a chosen one who will come and who will be able to control the Matrix, just inherently by being a chosen one. But at this point in the movie, it seemed like Neo actually was not who they thought he was. He wasn't the chosen one. And so he dies, he's killed. Oh no, tragedy, everything's bad. But as you saw, some fluke of fate proved that he must actually be the one, and therefore he cannot be dead, and so he returns to life. The second example I want to show you is from Buffy, Slayer of the Vampire. Spoilers for the end of season 1.
Verify the text?
So that's it, huh? I remember the drill. One Slayer dies, next one's called. Wonder who she is. Will you train her? Or will they send someone else?
Buffy,
Does say how he's gonna kill me? Do you think it'll hurt? I've got a way around it. I quit.
it's not that simple.
I'm making it that simple. I quit. I resign. I'm fired. You can find someone else to stop the master from taking over.
I'm not sure that anyone else can. All the signs indicate...
Signs? Read me the signs! Tell me my fortune! You're so useful sitting here with all of your books. You're really a lot of help.
I know this is hard.
What do you know about this? You're never gonna die.
You think I want anything to happen to you, huh? Do you think I could stand it? We just gotta figure out a way.
I already did. I quit, remember? Pay attention.
Buffy, if the master rises...
I don't care! I don't care. Giles, I'm 16 years old. I don't want to die.
The context for this particular clip is that Buffy is a chosen one. Again, she is the Slayer. One girl in all the world, she alone will have the strength to stand against the vampires, the demons, and the forces of darkness. In this moment, Buffy has just overheard a prophecy that she is about to die fighting the big bad guy. She absolutely does die, and she absolutely is revived. There were 7 seasons. It'd be wild if she died at the end of season 1 and they just kept on going without her. But she dies, she's revived. What I think is very significant about this particular scene with Buffy, if you want to see just how closely these story shapes reflect one another, think about how Buffy is rejecting her fate here and saying, I don't want to die, and compare it to the story of Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane. Just before Judas's betrayal and Jesus' arrest, Jesus and his disciples were in a garden, all his disciples fell asleep, and Jesus went to pray, and he prayed to God and said, I don't want to die. Is there any other way that we can do this?
I only want to say, if there is a way, take this cup away from me, for I don't want to taste its poison. Why should I die? Oh, why should I die?
My apologies for using the musical clip, it's just a little bit more dramatic than the actual biblical text. You get it. So we can see even our modern story, I mean, I know that these examples that I've picked are from like the late 90s and early 2000s. I don't need your judgment. I know that I'm old. Not my fault the last 10 years have all been reboots. These modern stories we're telling still so closely resemble the stories of old, of the dying and reviving God from ancient times. We're still clinging to them. I will, however, point out an interesting difference. All those examples Abed gave of stories that are about death and resurrection, the character who dies and is revived, instead of then being separated from the world and having to become this figure beyond mortal life, all of these characters, Superman, Spock, Buffy, they all return to their place. Even Neo, who now controls the Matrix, who is now, able to destroy Agent Smiths just because he decides to. He can fly, he can do whatever the hell he wants. He's still operating in essentially the same way that he was for the majority of the film, going into the Matrix via a telephone link and trying to free people one by one. So while we absolutely see this constant copy-paste of stories from our past over and over again everywhere we look, we also need to be able to recognize that those story shapes are changing. They are capable of change. And maybe, just maybe, we can begin to control the shapes that they take on. I think that's all I have to say to you. I hope that you enjoyed the lecture. Out of habit, I'm gonna walk off frame because this is what I do on YouTube. Bye.